Geology, geology, geology. Welcome everybody to another episode of Mini Geology. This is Daniel Benizini, your inquisitive geologist here in Houston. Today we have Szefer Karlsen. They are curator, writer, editor, and professor of curatorial practice at the University of Bergen in Norway. And their colleague Helga Niemann, they have created an art exhibition at Stavanger's Kunstmuseum, which is the art museum of this little city in Norway. The exhibition presents artworks by 16 artists, and the exhibition title is Experiences of Oil. Welcome to the show, Anne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, and the title of the exhibition is Experiences of Oil. Experiences by whom?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think this is a wonderful way into talking more about what this exhibition deals with. So Norway is one of the largest oil exporting countries of the world. So we are actually talking about the experiences that we as petro citizens might share with other people that live in other oil nations that also export oil. And we've made an exhibition that is let's say, inhabited by artists that also live and work in other oil exporting nations and describe the experiences that they have in the oil countries where they live.
So, Anne, what is your role in these experiences? Are you a narrator, a journalist, or a judge, or maybe the orchestra director?
Well, I guess technically I'm the curator of an art exhibition, but me as a petro citizen is a person who grew up on the east side of Norway, which does not have a direct relation to the oil industry, which is mostly located on the west side of the country. However, I had an uncle that worked on an oil platform when I grew up, and obviously I'm part of a generation that has never experienced the country that we live in without oil. So we have a discovery that dates back to 1968-69, and I was born in the middle of the 1970s. So my life has more or less been parallel with all the booms and the busts that the oil industry have thrown at us, and also in many ways created the foundation of my life. And I think that's maybe my role in this, is to investigate how has the oil industry impacted the lives that we live. And throughout my, let's say, the last 13 years of my career, I've had the pleasure and privilege of traveling to quite a few other oil nations. And what I discovered slowly but surely was that in conversation with colleagues and artists in these countries, there was something that we shared that was a little bit unsaid. It was something that was kind of under the surface in all our conversations. There was, when we had colleagues that maybe did not come from or live in oil nations, we had a shared language. There was something that we somehow understood about each other that I wanted to investigate further. So I'm maybe speaking from the position of a slightly traumatized and confused citizen.
What was that unsaid, untold thing that you are mentioning and referring to?
I think that the unsaid thing was that we knew that our lives were impacted very directly by an oil wealth, that we had privileges that others might not have, and that there was a complicitness that we probably should untangle. We would also meet, it wasn't only the privileged, but also the unprivileged that would meet and also share a language. And there is this relationship, I guess, between people and the oil industry that is quite unbalanced, where we know as individuals that we have to change something, but the things we need to change are on such a large systemic level that us as individuals are left a little bit helpless, let's say. And without becoming, an eco-activist or, extremely political in this context, I think that the untangling of both privileges and suffering was something that we shared. that we try to kind of reckon with and understand. And I think speaking to you, and also knowing that your background is in geology, I think it's quite interesting how the physicality of the world impacts our lives that are kind of running on emotions in a way. And this conflict is quite interesting to look at.
What is your personal emotion when you think about your experiences of oil?
Extremely conflicting. Of course, it is very conflicting. I think that I had a conversation with a colleague at the University of Bergen. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was, you know, how as university beings, we have to sometimes take pedagogical training and be in meetings that, you know, where you meet cross faculty. You meet people that you normally don't hang out with. And I was put in a Zoom room with a geologist, and we had to discuss pedagogical matters of how we are teaching. But our conversation soon very, very quickly slipped into me quizzing him about geology. So how is it that he became a geologist? How is it that the geology department of the university where we both work can kind of live with the paradox of receiving money from oil companies to do research for them, but at the same time be a public university that should not have public or have political interest in the industry, right? And he had a reflection which was very beautiful, where he said, well, you know, my generation, I thought always that I became a geologist of my own free will. He thought he was interested in geology because that was just his interest. But then as he kind of progressed through his training, he became a teacher, and now he's kind of training younger geologists. He understood that he had kind of been he'd been affected by the community that he had grown up in, and the social and the society that we are part of. And he's almost like pressured him into being a geologist, because we needed geologists. Obviously, we have a huge oil business, so we need to have engineers, we need to have geologists, we need to have certain types of workers. And maybe the conditions were put in that way so that this individual became a geologist rather than becoming a geologist of their own free will. But it never felt forced. And I think that this kind of invisibility of the pressure is something that we rarely talk about. And I think that we need to talk about that pressure without being moralizing, which has also been one of the, it's also been both the positive and the negative critique of the exhibition is that it doesn't moralize. So some people would have liked us to be more, you know, activist and more kind of moralizing and saying boo to oil, and others kind of appreciated that there is no finger raised. No one is telling you that you are wrong entering this space. And I think that's very important, making an exhibition in a place like Stavanger, which is kind of our oil, capital. It is where the most people work in the oil industry, and I think it's very important to respect that they have livelihoods and families that needs feeding, and you know that they have social interactions with each other, cross cultures, because it's a very international city because of the oil, and to kind of be respectful in talking about how their everyday work actually impacts so many more people. And I think that this lack of moralizing is something that at least I enjoy in conversations with oil workers that visit the exhibition, or that I happen to come across when I am in Stavanger myself.
So I understand how difficult it is that, and I appreciate that you could reach that point. Is this one of the achievements, or what are the other achievements that you would like to have with this exhibition?
Well, I think that looking at the structure where this exhibition takes place, which is a publicly supported museum, I always find that art institutions can be very elitist. They can be, you know, very difficult to enter for some, and that's absolutely no part related to their own experiences, but it is an institutional problem. And I think with this exhibition, it opens up for a wider audience to come and be curious about what this exhibition could be, and maybe enjoy going to a museum, because that's not what I love, going to museums, obviously, but not everyone might do that. So I think that for me, the museum or the art institution is part of the public sphere. And I think that we have a requirement almost to take part in public debate through the institutions that we work. So I work with the university, which also is a public institution, and I think that we should take part in public debate. And I think that we can also, from an artistic or maybe academic perspective, we're very privileged to have, our job is basically to try and create nuances. We don't have to be explicitly, this or that. It doesn't have to be plus or minus. It could be something in the middle or something, somewhere completely else. And I think that by making an exhibition that is so explicitly interested in one of the largest income-giving industries that we have in the country, we're taking part in public debate and widening the scope of how we can discuss this industry and how it impacts us.
The term being political in the loftiest sense, it means exactly what you said, having a public debate, being part of the polis. So you are doing politics in the high sense of the etymology of that word. Why do you curators, you are so you pay so much attention not to be political? Why is that? Why do you say that you try not to be political? What's wrong with being political?
Nothing is wrong with being political. That's a very, very good question. I think that maybe what I tried to say before, and I could nuance, is that I don't want to be one-sided. I would like to act in the polis, as you so rightly pointed out. I want to be in a public sphere that also is political, but not necessarily in a, let's say, in a party political way. Like, I don't want to necessarily take a side. Although I do have one, of course, I'm not an apolitical person, but I think I would like to take part in political life as an intellectual rather than as a politician, let's say. So by keeping options open and trying to bring people together to discuss and to share, and I think that's something that is very beautiful if you just look at the congregation of artworks that happens in the exhibition, is that they are not quiet and they are not unpolitical as artworks, but they are there and they all take the same, not the same, but they take enough space for their voice to be heard, and all these voices can be heard at the same time. And by moving through this room, you can have different experiences and be exposed to different utterances that I think all of them are political. I think art is political in and of itself. But I guess what I was misunderstood before, how I kind of phrased it, was that I was trying to be apolitical, which is not the case.
Do you think that you can influence the political discourse by showing artistic works?
I think that art can move mountains. Sorry for the geology fun right there. No, I think that cultural expressions and artworks are definitely important bits of our public discussion and our public debates. And not to say that this exhibition has produced that, but any kind of political cause, let's say, needs an image. Many social organizations, revolutions, whatever you have, there is always an image that is part of that fight, let's say, or the politics or the utterance that happens. Absolutely, I think that art is important. And I think that art is, in this case, important because it gives a nuance to the debate that we see in our mediascape, which I'm absolutely not undermining either. But I think that it's time to broaden the scope a little bit about how we discuss the oil industry, because no one is surprised when we say that we have to stop drilling for oil at some point. Being the temperature of this globe is a clear indication of that. I think that by making a one-sided argument for that huge transformation that needs to happen doesn't help the transformation. I think that we need to go forward in a nuanced way that gives space for discussion on the way. And I don't think that anyone, if I may be so bold as to try to speak on behalf of those that have been part of this exhibition, I don't think any one of us would say that, oh, no, we're going to continue this forever.
And so, Anne, a personal question that needs to put you in a spot different than curator of your own exhibition. You, as a citizen that has experienced so many countries related with oil, that have seen so many points of view thanks to your artist colleagues, and that all the material that you have been studied. If you had a magic wand, what would you like to do with the oil tomorrow?
Which oil? The one that is in the ground or the one that is not in the ground?
All the oil.
All the oil. I will honestly tell you that that question is such a big question that I don't even know where to start. If you may allow me not to answer, but that is, again, a very good question, which I think is why you're on your end of this conversation and I'm on my end.
It is interesting, though, the no answer to that question, because it probably shows the complexity of oil, right? I mean, I think that you have seen so many people that they work around oil, and that they have had good discoveries for science, technology, and the society at large. But then you understand also the horrors of oil, and so I take this as a moment of pause where we have to think about the consequences of the choices that we would take.
No, I think you're right, but I think we also need to acknowledge that without the oil, there are certain medicines we wouldn't have had. That again, we need to nuance which oil is it that we're talking about, and for what purpose does it exist. But I think that we discovered when we were working with the exhibition quite early on, maybe in 2000, maybe throughout 2020, when we started to talk about this exhibition more publicly, or more, let's say we were sharing a bit more about this project coming up. I think throughout those conversations, at a certain point, we came up with this idea that we need to share the trauma. And that it was kind of the traumatic part of being an oil citizen was kind of what we were not talking about in the beginning. And then I think at some point we just understood that we have to be quite transparent about the difficulty that this project will pose to us. I mean, the problem that it's going to pose us as creators of the project itself, that we of course don't have any answers. We knew that all along, but that we could also be explicit about the fact that this is quite difficult to talk about. We're talking about the livelihoods for many people. We're talking about the financial stability of, or at least we imagine it's the financial stability of the whole nation that we live in, that there is a double standard that I spoke about earlier with exporting oil, but also about being operative in other national spheres, that this is quite traumatic as an individual to carry. And I think that this shared trauma is also maybe something that we share, that the complexity of being an oil citizen and not maybe wanting to be one at the same time is something that creates some conflict internally.
Anna, can you tell us a little bit about the methodology, more than the content now, the methodology that you use in order to bring together these artists and your choices? Why do you think they are representative, or maybe they are not representative of all those petro countries? How did you come up with these choices, and why?
So I guess this is something that has been growing for many, many years through talking with and listening to artist colleagues. And of course, also deeply influenced by the fact that the exhibition happens in Stavanger. So we shouldn't forget the role that the location of the exhibition plays in the choices that are made. But I think that that the methodology is the whole kind of let's say the floor plan of the exhibition is like a sprawling geography where you can, in one way maybe say that you can kind of easily go from, you can go from the Emirates to Australia in a few strides in the space. So you kind of see this, it's almost like a breaking up of geography, that we kind of break open the map and we reconfigure it. And by doing that, we create a new neighborhood for Norway. Because obviously, although I would, I'm kind of trying out the idea that we recognize ourselves in others, and that would go both ways. So if I spoke to someone from Kuwait, they would say the same about Norway. That's obviously not true. So it comes from a very Norwegian perspective. But I guess the aim is to try to create a different neighborhood than the one that we are normally positioned in, which very often is the kind of Northern European, very successful social democracy, where there is free healthcare, all education is free, like all of the beauty of, let's say, that type of narrative, which in the Norwegian context would be that we share with countries like Sweden and Denmark and Finland and Iceland, etc. But maybe what if we had a different neighborhood? I guess is the methodology that we're kind of trying out. Like, what if we could create other kind of kinships and communities than those that we normally are prone to discuss ourselves in, because it is also a reflection of a success in that neighborhood that we so often is put in. So we're trying to challenge that idea of maybe identity that has is perpetually enforced, let's say.
But within the neighborhood of Norway, I see in your description that there is a plethora of very good positive elements related to oil. What are the negative ones if you remain within your neighborhood and you look exclusively to Norway?
Well, I think that the the Norwegian oil story changed in the middle of the 90s when the what today is called Equinor, which is the largest oil company of Norway, which previously was fully owned by the government, but now is to a majority owned by the government. They started to explore in other parts of the world. And I think that this is a shift that came about also at the same time as Norway established a sovereign wealth fund. So it's called the Oil Fund. I can't remember the correct term in English, but I think it's called Global Pension Funds, something like that. So it's got to do with global investment to secure pension funds for the future generations. And this sovereign wealth fund is one of the largest in the world. And obviously it comes through, the money that they invest is generated through this one oil company, or the taxation of this one oil company. And I think that in the 90s, our kind of innocence, let's say, as an oil nation changed the minute we stepped outside of our own borders. So I think that's something that maybe we don't discuss that often in this context. We have a tendency to talk about the oil industry as a fairy tale. That is something that we were very lucky to have. That is something that has been, this enormous energy that has gone into drilling oil on our continental shelf in the middle of the North Sea, which is a very unhospitable place on Earth. It can be stormy, it can be cold, and it can be very, very dangerous to work there. But yet we managed, right? So it's a success story. But I think that what we have refrained from discussing is the minute that we've stepped outside of our own borders and we impact other parts of the world in very direct ways, and the responsibility that might have or might not have been taken by our placeholders, let's say, in the world. which is our representatives through this oil company. And I think that there is maybe there is a beginning discussion about that, which has maybe led to other popular cultural references. So just now, I think we're in season 2 of something called Lykkeland, which is a TV series, when it's airing on the BBC, it's called State of Happiness. And it is a dramatization of the beginning of the oil industry in Norway. And it's beautifully produced and it's extremely addictive as television series goes. We cannot stop watching it. But it also tells a very particular story about the Norwegian oil business, which is then set aside as an exceptional difference to the rest of the world.
Can
So
you
it's
give us an example of the negativity related to the oil experience of Norway when it steps out of its own borders?
well, I think that there is a lack of maybe I'm not entirely sure that I am very qualified to talk about this, but this is maybe something that comes from living in an oil nation, and I'm reflecting the mediascape that is around me and maybe what I'm lacking in that media coverage. So there is, for instance, one thing that has been highlighted within our borders is that we have been able to secure labor legislations for workers, so that it's a very safe business. There are very few deaths. There are very few accidents happening, and it comes back to the point that work life is highly regulated, which is by law, and it's for everyone that is a worker in Norway. But then when we move abroad, we don't take those standards with us. So we might absolutely follow the labor legislations of Brazil, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe to work in that business, even though it is a Norwegian owned company that is maybe drilling for oil somewhere.
But isn't this a topic that could be equivalent to whatever other industry this would be?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
No, I completely agree.
yeah, because I'm trying to really understand for the Norwegians' point of view, where is the negativity, where is the dark side of their oil experience, which it seems is almost doesn't exist. While I can understand from the other parts of the world. So I was trying to investigate this with you and asking your personal view and so that's why I'm trying to dig a little bit deeper into this.
No, I think it's maybe the very glaring double standards that appear that is difficult to live with, and that also seems difficult to impact, because clearly when the production of this company and its gains enters into a sovereign wealth fund that in practice owns 1% of all the stocks on any stock market in the world, it is a huge power. And I think that the double standards in this is maybe the troubling bit. But I absolutely agree that the labor rights in many parts of the world, in most industries, are questionable. Let's say that's a big statement, but you know what I mean. Like I see the complexity, but I also don't see other businesses that have such huge revenues that the oil business does, which gives a little bit of extra responsibility, I guess.
What is the reaction of the visitors? And is it different, the reaction, if the visitors are Norwegians or foreigners?
This is a very, very good question, and I am curious to know the answer myself, because I live in a different part of the country than Stavanger, so I cannot go and sneak peek at the exhibition whenever I want to. But I'm going back this weekend, so I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues at the museum how the reception has been. My experience from the opening weekend was that there were many kind of varied. There was a different feedback from different people, but it didn't necessarily follow national lines, but rather maybe their backgrounds in where they worked. So I tried to listen in on every conversation and see if I could speak with someone from the oil business, which I did, and those were very, very interesting conversations to have. But I'm also curious to know the details of the feedback. The feedback I know is the one from the art critics and those that have been writing about it.
So you still don't have any feedback from, let's say, the oil industry?
No, not so much. Although I have to say that my LinkedIn profile has been visited by quite a few representatives of oil companies lately, so I'm sure they know about the exhibition.
You maybe want to be proactive and poke them because sometimes industry is pretty shy of coming out, is bold on some actions, but is shy on some other ones. So uh, pushing the envelope, trying to let them sit around the table and discuss
Mm,
could be very beneficial, um, because industry may have points of view that sometimes you do not expect,
mm,
simply because they are shy on communication. And communication sometimes may be um, very targeted with maybe second purposes.
absolutely. It's clear that those that work in the industry, and I'm not necessarily talking about the top boss or the communications department, but those that work in the industry knows and feels this pressure on their bodies every day. And those are the ones that I would love to have a conversation with. And I think that those are populating the exhibition as audiences just by sheer numbers. There are so many lives that are touched by this industry in Stavanger that I think most everyone who's gone through those spaces have some kind of relation to the oil industry.
What would you like to know from them?
I would like to know, what would I like to know? Ooh, that's a very good question. I would have so many questions. But I think that I would like to hear whether they also feel that there is a kinship between oil countries, because this is something that is the speculation of the proposition, that, that there are shared experiences between those that live in oil countries. And we also know that oil countries have large concentrations of oil workers, clearly. So I would be curious to know if they have that experience. And I came across some very wonderful. Uh, I had some really really meaningful conversations when we were installing the exhibition. One of them is a British artist who lives in Stavanger who was helping us install the exhibition. And after a few days, when we installed the works of Farah Al-Qasimi, who's a photographer, she's an artist out of the Arab Emirates, and her main medium is photography. So we were installing some really colorful, wonderful photographs from interior spaces and from shopping malls in the Emirates. And all of a sudden, he said that, oh, this reminds me of when I was a kid, because my dad was an oil worker and I used to live in the Emirates. And it was like, oh, okay, so there is a kinship. So you feel that there is a connection, right? And he was like, yes, of course. Yeah, my experience tells me that I understand these images in a very meaningful way. And I think that it's those kind of points of recognition that I am curious to see if has happened. And I'm very happy that I'm not a scientist, that I am working in culture where we can kind of propose the wildest things and see if the feedback is adequate, let's say.
And actually, well, I tell you first my humble experience as an individual on the differences between countries, since I've also traveled in countries related and unrelated to oil. And I see that there's a commonality about the reason why students they choose earth sciences or geology. In countries where you have oil, that choice is similar to what people choose as when they choose to study law or economy. So they are driven by a career. They're looking for a career.
Mm.
In countries where you do not have oil, students that they choose to study geology, they are students that on one side maybe they couldn't enter engineer, because it was maybe too difficult or something strange happened there. On the other side, they are mountaineers, hikers, nature
Mm-hmm.
lovers that they decide to understand how the world works.
Yeah.
And this is very interesting because those students that they study in countries unrelated with oil, they produce a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of research, and they have a peculiar curiosity unrelated to the ones that they choose geology otherwise. And so they become a very important part of the workforce of the oil countries because these students they generate knowledge that is not generated in places associated with oil
Mm.
simply because they're driven by pure curiosity, and the other ones that are more driven by need of the market or by the what the workforce requires from you as a student.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And I think it also is in line with the story I heard from my geologist colleague at the university that you think you're driven by curiosity, but maybe there is something else as well. Because I do not want to underestimate the work that is done by geologists coming from oil countries, of course, but that there is an added something there.
And also, one other question that I have for you about feedback is your relationship with academics, academics of the earth sciences,
Mm.
academics that they study the petroleum systems, petroleum geology. What is the reaction from these people?
I'm again very curious to hear. I think that the ones that I've been most in touch with are people more from the cultural sphere that also approaches this exhibition and the artworks in it with the kind of cultural curiosity. But I am very curious when I get there in a few. Actually, on Sunday I will arrive, and on Monday we get to go and see the exhibition again and to hear about the feedback because I know that they had we have, of course, educational programs that runs alongside the exhibition. There are a lot of school children that travel through the show that I'm very curious to hear their feedback to the mediators and programmers at the museum. And I was extremely impressed by the amount of schools that they, I mean, had it not been COVID, let's say, because there has been a few lockdowns since the opening, but that the numbers of students that they could take through the exhibitions were in the thousands. And this kind of support for mediation programs is just almost unheard of. And I think it comes from the fact that those that give funding for these programs also want the younger generations to be aware of and to discuss this industry, which is so important to where we live.
You brought together a very good, nice, large group of people, of artists, that they show their point of view, their experience of oil. Can you give us an overarching view of what are the view of this international and Norwegian artists? What do they think about oil? What do they try to say? What do you see in their art?
Mm. Ooh, this is very tempting to describe all the different works in detail to you now, but I don't think we have time for that. So I will maybe focus on a few. Um, the opening work is quite a modest installation by an art collective called Rax Media Collective, with a work that is called 36 Planes of Emotions. And this work is a table with the surface of a mirror, and on top of the mirrors you can see 36 book-like objects that are made in plexiglass or perspex. And on the kind of the book end, you could say, there are little sentences. And this work is in the beginning of our exhibition because we understood it. We have kind of understood ourselves as speaking beings. So the human is a speaking being, and it is through the spoken word that we share our experiences. So we wanted to kind of let the audience maybe be reminded that it is through language that we share our emotions. And that was then picked up on by the artist collective, who invited an author from Stavanger to contribute with the work that are 9 poem-like sections that have been read into a wonderful little podcast, one could say, that is also in the exhibition space. So I think that's how we wanted to maybe not necessarily connect emotionally to the audience at the minute you came into the space, but we wanted to remind the audiences that it is through language that we share our experiences. So there is an artist in the show called Brienne Vinter. She grew up not very far from Stavanger herself, and she makes these very detailed and kind of chaotic and wonderful and colorful drawings. And I have to say that when I reached out to her to have a studio visit, this was in COVID times, it all had to happen online, of course, and we were kind of stuck in our different workspaces and home spaces. And I had followed her work since she was a student at the University of Bergen, or at the Art Academy where I work, and thought she would be a wonderful voice to include in this show, to talk about, in her kind of chaotic way, what this experience could feel like. Because as me, she is socialized in Norway. I thought for sure she would have a very interesting perspective. And 20 minutes into this conversation, she says, well, you do know that I did work on an oil platform for 13 years. And I was absolutely unaware, which was me not paying attention when I was reading about her work before. So she had been a sledge mechanic at an oil platform let's say, in a previous life, which gave her a very, very particular experience of oil. Her experience is being a woman on an oil platform and what that means. She has, of course, a very tangible understanding of what the industry is, and also about what the material of oil is. So she had a very particular way of handling this invitation, and made a suite of works that follows us throughout the exhibition, where she kind of addresses oil in a way. She speaks to the industry as coming from her perspective. So these are colorful drawings that hang in different constellations throughout the exhibition space, and she also had access to all the other artworks in the exhibition as much as we could make them available to her before the exhibition opened. So she is also very much in response to her colleagues from other countries. And this is, you can kind of track that in the work that she made. So it's a really beautiful comment on the exhibition itself. Then, speaking of image making, maybe I could also talk a little bit about Trinidadian Chris Cozier, who has also made a suite of drawings for the exhibition. These are black and white ink drawings that are hung in kind of grid-like systems in the middle of a room, and when you light them, they kind of throw shadows around the world of the room, and it looks really like a stage set in a way. But his project, which is called Turbulence, is a way of trying to alter the way that we see the Caribbean, because this is a region in the world that has been, of course, when I say the Caribbean to you, I'm sure you're thinking of some kind of beautiful landscape, some kind of wonderful beach, some kind of, it's all beautiful. You have it in the background, so we can really dig into it from this perspective. But what we are very rarely exposed to is that there are other stories about the Caribbean that we might that we should pay more attention to. And one of those stories is something that Chris has unearthed, which is not a secret, I'm sure, to you, but that the first commercially viable oil well in the world was drilled in Trinidad in 1857. So really, he inhabits the beginning of the oil space. And he kind of shows that to us through the drawings. And I think this is something that needs to also be exposed, let's say, that there are many different stories to one place. And in this case, we're of course focusing on the oil stories. And what else could I talk about? We could maybe mention the work of Monira Al-Qadiri, which is a series of 6 flying sculptures, which of course sounds amazing, and they are. But these are 3D prints of drill bit heads that has been turned upside down and I will reveal the secret, they are 3D printed in a very light plastic material, and they are, shiny and beautiful in color, and they hover above their pedestals helped by magnets. So they fly and they kind of turn very slowly around, and they are absolutely magnificent, and they draw everyone in, of course, as they should. In many ways, they are a comment on the results of oil wealth, which we see many places means wonderful infrastructures. That there are big towers, there is an expansion of infrastructure in terms of roads and buildings and other kinds, hospitals, schools, you name it. But also these drill bit heads, when they're turned upside down, they look very much like tower-like structures that you might see in the Middle East, she is from Kuwait herself, so they very much connect to the urban landscape that she knows well. And I think that many in the oil business also will recognize because they travel through this region quite often. So there are a mix of, let's say, impressions that you can recognize, like Monira's with the architectural reference to a Middle Eastern or Gulf architecture. And then there are, of course, perspectives that you might not know so much about, which is what is the woman's perspective working on an oil rig, or someone coming and living in the Caribbean, which is portrayed to be this perfect, wonderful pearl of a place on this earth, and that there might be a backside to that.
I really hope that you have the possibility to drag industry and academia around the table to talk with the artist or the concept artist and discuss openly, because I feel, being in the capital of oil, Houston, that the time is ready. The ears are open, and these characters of the play, industry and academia, that sometimes they're entrenched because they produce money or they receive budget to do the research. It seems that they wouldn't listen. Instead, this is the moment. And the material is warm, hot, is ready to be forged. I really hope that you can have an extension beyond Stavanger, especially now with the COVID and the virtual reality. You can reach many other people to sit around your table.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you for the encouraging optimism that you have there. But I don't know if are we getting close to the end, perhaps? Because
Yes.
I'd like to just share a tiny little anecdote with you again. Right at the one of the last research trips I was going to make for this project was to Houston, and it was going to be in April 2020. And as you know, that didn't happen. So I still have a trip to Houston kind of in my back pocket, and would love to come and experience your oil city and see if I can find any more similarities or have other conversations. So I'm hopeful that we will meet.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne and Szefer Karlsen. They are curator, writer, editor, and professor of curatorial practice at the University of Bergen in Norway. And together with their colleague Helga Niemann, they have created an art exhibition at Stavanger that we have been talking about. And the title of that exhibition is Experiences of Oil. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist. If you want to write, you can write at minigeology@gmail.com, and you can see this clip in the minigeology.com website. Thank you, everybody, and thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you.